I want to begin with a measurement, not a dramatic measurement, a mundane one. The main hall of the Gare d'Orsay in Paris, now the Musée d'Orsay, is 138 meters long, 40 meters wide, and 32 meters high at the apex of its vaulted ceiling. These are the internal dimensions of what was officially built as a railway terminal, completed in 1900. The track level is at the basement. The Great Hall is above. And the Great Hall, with its 32-meter ceiling and its vast open floor, was, according to official history, the ticketing and waiting area for passengers, using the underground tracks below. A ticketing area with a 32-meter ceiling. A passenger concourse with enough vertical clearance to comfortably accommodate a structure 10 stories tall. I spent a long time looking at that ceiling, not photographing it, which is what most people do when they visit the Musée d'Orsay, just looking at it. Asking the question that the official designation seems designed to prevent you from asking. Why does a railway station need a 10-story ceiling? Why does a passenger waiting area require this much vertical clearance? What were the architects imagining when they specified that dimension? What needed to fit inside this space that required 32 meters of vertical room? The official answer is aesthetic. The vaulted ceiling is beautiful. The ironwork is extraordinary. The glass admits light in a way that creates a specific atmosphere. And all of that is true. But aesthetic intention doesn't explain structural specification. You can make a beautiful vaulted ceiling at 15 meters. You can admit extraordinary light with 20 meters of clearance. You don't need 32 meters of vertical space to create a beautiful passenger concourse. Unless the space was designed for something that needed 32 meters of vertical clearance to function. And passenger trains don't need 32 meters of vertical clearance. I came to this investigation through the measurements. I am not, by training or temperament, someone who looks for hidden meaning in architecture. I am someone who notices when numbers don't add up. And the numbers in certain 19th century buildings that were officially constructed as railway stations, exhibition halls, market halls, and government buildings in the period between approximately 1850 and 1900 consistently don't add up in the same direction. They are too large, too tall, too open, too carefully designed for an interior volume that no stated purpose actually requires. Let me be specific about the pattern, because the pattern is everything here. Railway stations built in this period fall into two categories. There are stations where the dimensional specifications track logically against the function. A vaulted ceiling high enough to clear steam and locomotive exhaust, a concourse wide enough to accommodate passenger flow, platform lengths sized to train lengths. The functional dimensions of actual railway operation. And then, there are stations where the dimensions exceed any functional requirement by a factor that should have triggered questions in the people who approved the budgets and the structural specifications. The Gare d'Orsay, St. Pancras in London, with its vaulted train shed 74 meters wide and 30 meters high. The original Pennsylvania station in New York, demolished in 1963, whose main waiting room was modeled on the baths of Caracalla and rose 30 meters above street level. The Grand Central Terminal, also in New York, whose main concourse ceiling reaches 23 meters and whose total internal volume far exceeds any reasonable calculation of passenger handling needs. These buildings are described as monuments to the railway age, expressions of civic ambition, demonstrations of what industry and capital could achieve, and perhaps that is what they are. But I keep coming back to the specific pattern of excess, not excess decoration, though they are extraordinarily decorated, excess volume, excess vertical clearance, excess internal space, as if they were designed for a function whose requirements included, as a non-negotiable specification, the ability to accommodate something large and tall and requiring significant overhead clearance. Something that doesn't exist in any official account of what these buildings were for. Let me take you through the approach geometry problem, because this is where the official explanation becomes most structurally difficult. Many of the large 19th century stations that we're discussing have a specific spatial feature that railway operation neither requires nor particularly benefits from. A large, clear, level approach space directly adjacent to the main building, not the station forecourt, which is explained by carriage and pedestrian traffic. Something more specific. A wide, flat, unobstructed zone immediately preceding the primary entrance, oriented to a compass direction that in several cases aligns with the prevailing local wind. A clear approach into an enormous, high-ceilinged space. If you were designing a facility for arriving aircraft, for something that needed to decelerate from flight and enter a covered space, you would specify almost exactly this configuration. A clear approach. A wide entry. An interior with sufficient ceiling height to accommodate the vehicle and its operational envelope. And then internal dimensions large enough to store and service multiple vehicles simultaneously. I am not claiming these buildings were airports. I am noting that their dimensional specifications are consistent with having been designed for something that required as a primary operational parameter significant interior vertical clearance and a clear exterior approach. And I am noting that the official functions assigned to them do not account for these specifications. The excess is too consistent and too specific to be purely aesthetic. Here is where the broader pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The buildings I'm describing were not built by the same architect, in the same city, in the same decade. They were built across multiple continents, in multiple countries, by different architects, working in different cultural and technical traditions, over a period of roughly 50 years. And they share not just stylistic vocabulary, though they do share a remarkable degree of stylistic vocabulary, but dimensional philosophy, a consistent approach to interior volume, to ceiling height, to the relationship between the building envelope and the usable interior space. That suggests not independent parallel development, but a shared specification, as if the architects were all working from the same brief, as if the buildings were all designed to accommodate the same unstated function. The period in which they were built is also, and I don't think this is a coincidence, the period that researchers in this area have identified as the inheritance period. The decades between approximately 1850 and 1900, when new administrative and commercial structures appeared across the world at a speed and scale that official construction timelines struggle to account for. Cities that were allegedly wilderness in 1840 had elaborate railway terminals by 1870. Cities that had officially existed for 30 years had the civic infrastructure of mature civilizations. And the buildings themselves, when you look at them carefully, don't look like the products of a 30-year-old city. They look like the products of a civilization with a long tradition of ambitious public building, a tradition of engineering sophistication, a tradition that understood exactly what these spaces needed to do and specified their dimensions accordingly. What function? Let me be direct about the hypothesis. Not because I can prove it, but because refusing to name it serves no one. There are accounts, in several traditions across several cultures, of pre-modern vehicles capable of flight or near flight. The Vimanas of Indian tradition, described in texts of considerable antiquity as craft capable of carrying people and goods through the air, sometimes at great speed. The airship traditions of pre-modern China. The aerial transport accounts in certain pre-Columbian traditions. The European accounts of aerial phenomena in the pre-modern period that official history has filed under folklore or religious vision. What if some of these traditions described real phenomena? What if the civilization that the maps called Tartaria operated vehicles or vessels that required the kind of infrastructure I'm describing? Not aircraft in the modern sense, not jet propulsion or internal combustion. Something that operated in a different physical register, that we don't have the theoretical framework to understand because the knowledge that would have explained it was lost or erased in the same period that the buildings were reassigned to new functions and given new names above the old doors. I want to be clear about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming there were aircraft in the 19th century. I am claiming that certain 19th century buildings have dimensional specifications that are not accounted for by their official functions, and that the pattern of these specifications is consistent and deliberate enough to suggest a shared underlying purpose that no official history has named. I am claiming that the inheritance period, the decades in which these buildings appeared at impossible speed across multiple continents, corresponds to the period in which Tartaria disappeared from the maps. And I am claiming that the combination of unaccounted-for structural specifications and impossible construction speed suggests that some of these buildings may not have been built by the civilizations that occupied them, but inherited from a previous occupant who had different needs and different capabilities. The evidence doesn't resolve cleanly into a single explanation. That's the honest position. What the evidence does, persistently and frustratingly, is refuse to resolve into the official explanation either. The official explanation requires you to believe that the architects of these buildings specified 30 meters of vertical clearance for aesthetic reasons, that the dimensional excesses are monuments to ambition rather than functional requirements. And that explanation is always available. It is always the explanation that requires the least adjustment to the accepted narrative. It is always the explanation that closes the question rather than opening it. I prefer to keep the question open, because closed questions don't find answers. And the question of what these buildings were built for, what function their impossible ceilings and unaccountable vertical clearances were designed to serve, is a question that the buildings themselves are still asking, every day in the spaces above our heads that we have learned to photograph and admire, and never quite look at long enough to wonder why they're there. The Gare d'Orsay is now an art museum. The paintings are beautiful, but the ceiling is still 32 meters high, and no painting has ever needed 32 meters of ceiling. The function that required that height is gone, but the height remains, as it always does. Stone remembers what people are trained to forget.